Let's do it. So this Shabbat is going to be called Parshat Zachor. And there's a lot of hoopla about Parshat Zachor. And people say all kinds of things like, it's a biblical mitzvah to hear the reading of Parshat Zachor. Why is it a biblical mitzvah? Well, because Haman was from Amalek, so we have to remember Amalek. So therefore it's a biblical mitzvah to remember Amalek on the Shabbat before Purim. That makes absolutely no sense. Because Haman and the story of Purim happens many centuries after the close of the Bible. And there is no 614th biblical mitzvah. There are 7 mitzvahs, the Rabbanan, 7 rabbinic mitzvahs, including the mitzvahs of Purim, and there are 613 biblical mitzvahs, which this purports to be. And of course, how in heaven could that be true?
But there's a Amalek in every generation.
There may be a Amalek in every generation, but how could it be a mitzvah to read the Torah at Purim time? How could that be biblical? So this is a mystery that a lot of people just don't know the answer to. And we're going to set out in the next 45 minutes or so to clarify this. We're going to go, we're going to travel to a lot of different places. So hold on to your seats, and I will try to share with you the details as they unfold, giving you just as much, enough for you to be able to follow. So I'm going to begin with one of the earliest documentations that describe the concept of Torah reading on a regular basis. And this is from the Rambam, Maimonides. We're going back nearly 8.5 centuries. In the Laws of Prayer, chapter 12, the Rambam begins with the following words. Moshe Rabbeinu, Tikun Lahem LiYisrael. It was Moses who instituted that the Jewish people should be koyrin b'Torah, should be reading the Torah berabim, in a public way. Everybody knows the Torah gets read public. It's part of Judaism. You come to shul, the Torah gets read. Rambam tells you it's a mosaic or rabbinic injunction. He is the one who established this for Shabbat, b'Sheni, u'b'Chamishi, b'Shachrit. Monday, Thursday, and Shabbat in the morning, not Shabbat afternoon. That was something that Ezra came at a later point and established so that people wouldn't sit around on the street corners. In the language, the verbiage that the Alter Rebbe uses, in Siman Reish Pei Beis, chapter 282 of the Code of Jewish Law, Orach Chaim, he says, as I explained elsewhere, unfortunately elsewhere we don't have because it was lost in a fire, those manuscripts, Moshe Rabbeinu Tikun Lahem LiYisrael Sheyukodim B'Sefer Torah. Here we have the exact words as we know it. Moshe instituted we should read the Sefer Torah. And he talks about how many aliyot. There's 5 aliyot on Yom Tov, and 6 in Yom Kippur, and 7 on the Shabbat. And that's because there are different grades or levels of holiness. There you have it. The Torah reading is a rabbinic injunction. How could there be a biblical mitzvah to read the Torah publicly? That makes no sense. And now it doesn't make no sense, but specifically, if we look at the Torah reading of Parshat Zachor, you'll see clearly that it's something that the rabbis instituted. This is a Mishnah that we're familiar with. We already looked at this Mishnah in our previous class about Parshat Shkolim. So it's a Mishnah on the bottom of page 29 of Masechet Megillah, and the Mishnah opens with the discussion of the reading of Parshat Shkolim, which we talked about in a previous class. And after giving us those details, the Mishnah says, Umafsikin. Then we make an interruption. So we have the first reading, what is arguably the oldest biblical reading, the oldest Torah reading in history, somewhere very early on, reminding people it's time to give you shekels. And then we break for a Shabbos. And B'Shnia, in the second Shabbos, we read Zachor. That's all you get in the Mishnah. B'Shnia Zachor. So Rashi says, why do we stop? Why would we interrupt? If you have 4 special readings, then you should do 4 special readings in succession. So Rashi says, the reason that you stop is because you stop, he says, the interruption is from the Parsha Shnia, and the reason is, Kedei shetikra Parshat Zachor b'Shabbat hasmucha lePurim, so that we should read the Parsha of Remembrance, of what Amalek did to us, close to Purim. And the reason that we do that is lismoch, to draw close, mechiat Amalek, the erasing of Amalek, lemechiat Haman, to the erasing or drowning out of Haman. And as is customary, when Haman's name is read, we make noise. There are even some communities that have a custom of making noise on Parshat Zachor when we read the name Amalek. And therefore Rashi says there's a direct link between Purim and between this special reading. And because there's a link, that's why we interrupt. Usually we don't have interruptions. Once we start doing something, we just carry it straight through to the end. Okay, we interrupt. And the reason we interrupt is because the second reading of Parshat Zachor we want to be doing in proximity to Purim. Purim is a rabbinic holiday. How could Parshat Zachor be a biblical reading? How could it be a biblical mitzvah to read Parshat Zachor if Rashi tells us clearly that the reason we interrupt is because we want to attach this to the holiday of Purim? The thing is, though, that the very same Alter Rebbe who we just quoted before in chapter 282 of the Shulchan Aruch actually says as much later on in the same chapter. In the same chapter of Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Tezayin, which is the subchapter 16, he talks about the concept of maftir, of the added-on reading, the extra reading. And he says that when it comes to maftir, you actually do not have to call a bar mitzvah boy. You can call even a katan to maftir, as long as the child knows who God is, so to speak, and he has an idea of what he's doing. And then he says, the afal pi sheparshat Zachor hi chova min haTorah, even though Parshat Zachor is obligatory by dint of the Bible, Torah, Shiashme'ena kol adam Yisrael, that every single member of the Jewish people should hear this Torah reading. V'hakatan she'eni mechuyev b'davar, and the child who is not obligated, because everything a child does is elective, eini yachal lo yitzir midei chavasan, he cannot then fulfill their responsibility. So you cannot have a child reading this portion. But the Alter Rebbe says he can still get the aliyah. After all, it is not the one who gets the aliyah that reads, but already since the time of the Rishonim, we have a Bal Korah, an official person whose job is to read the Torah. So the Torah reader reads. Now what's the problem? It doesn't make a difference if a child or somebody who is not yet bar mitzvah has that aliyah. The important thing is that there's a shliach tzibur, there's a Bal Korah who's reading it in a loud voice, and he is mashmiel at tzibur. He makes sure that everybody's able to hear. So, the very same Alter Rebbe who starts off chapter 282 by reminding you that it was Moshe Rabbeinu, or a rabbinic injunction to read the Torah on Shabbat, tells you in the same chapter that Zachor is Chovah min HaTorah. That Zachor is obligatory by dint of biblical ordination. How do you work that out? How could that be? How could you have a Torah reading which comes from the Torah when the reading of the Torah in public is but a rabbinic idea? So that is the premise of today's class now, so we're going to try to find out. So the first thing that I'm going to share with you is no less than four sources for the concept that the reading of Parshat Zachor is actually biblical. The first place I'm going to take you to now is Masechet Brachot. And there's a discussion in the Talmud and the Gemara about the Hebraic nature of the scripture. If it was always has to be read in Hebrew, or only sometimes has to be read in Hebrew. There's a discussion. I don't want to go into the details of the discussion. What's important here is to understand that the Torah has a nuanced way of describing the Shema, which seems to indicate that it has to be read specifically in Hebrew. So the Tosfos asks a question, and he says that Rashi interprets this as not reading the Shema, but rather reading the Torah. And he says the Torah was given to us originally in Hebrew and has to be read in its original Hebrew. And Tosfos says, I don't understand what that means. After all, it is a rabbinic injunction to read the Torah. What does Rashi mean when he says we're biblically mandated to read the Torah? The Torah was given in Hebrew and is biblically mandated that we read it in Hebrew. So the Tosfos says, V'yesh leimar, perhaps what Rashi means is the mighty beparshiyos hamechuyavin likros d'oraisa. It speaks about the biblical Torah readings, and he goes plural here. He says the biblical Torah readings. For example, what's a biblical Torah reading? K'may Parshat Zachor. So the Tosfos on page 13, side A, the last Tosfos, is telling us clearly that there are biblical Torah readings, and the poster boy for biblical Torah readings is Parshat Zachor. So there is a biblical Torah reading. The Tosfos? About 7 centuries ago. Now I'm going to take you to another Tosfos. The Tosfos is a compendium of the Rishonim, of the medieval sages and their commentary on the Gemara. There's something called Tosfos Aksarim. There are minor Tosfos, and then there are longer Tosfos called Tosfos Shantz. I can't go into those details now, but I just wanted to show you a source in Rishonim, which is some of the earliest documented writings of the Rishonim, of the medieval sages who come after the close of the Talmud, and they're telling us clearly that Parshat Zachor is biblical. Here's another Tosfos. This Tosfos is found in the Masechet Megillah, on the top of page 17b. Similar discussion in the Gemara about the origin of the scripture, Hebrew, not Hebrew, read in Hebrew. A whole discussion about this. I don't want to go into the details. Again, the issue with Rashi saying the biblical Torah reading. And the Tosfos says, what's going on here? Pirush HaKuntris shenitna likres b'chol lashon. You can read it in any language, and even though it's biblical, but he said, what do you mean? It's not biblical. V'kosha, Tosfos says, this is difficult to understand. Hari kriyas haTorah einem min haTorah. The reading of the Torah is not from the Torah. Ella midrabanan. It comes from rabbinic sources, as we've learned. Levad, with one exception. Levad mi Parshat Zachor, with the exception of Parshat Zachor. Now, these two Tosfos are not of the same version. One is a minor, the Tosfos Aksarim, the shorter Tosfos. Here we have what's called Tosfos Shantz, and that's a whole kettle of fish I don't want to get into. But the first Tosfos says Parshiot, plural. This Tosfos says there's one biblical Torah reading, and that biblical Torah reading is Parshat Zachor. So I have shown you two sources now, in which we see that there is a biblical concept of Torah reading, and the biblically mandated Torah reading is Parshat Zachor. Let's go on now to a third source. I'm going to answer your questions a little later. I want to just try to make progress here, because we're on a time constraint. So now I'm going to take you to the writings of the Rosh, the commentary of the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, who is one of the original codes, one of the first codes written on the actual Talmud. And this is a Rosh which is found in Masechet Brachot, chapter 7, and the subchapter here is 20. By means of preface, there is this notion of something called an Eved Kanani, which means an indentured laborer, a person who is supposed to be a quasi kind of part of the Jewish people. He's part of the Jewish people as a laborer. He is inducted into the family of the Jewish people, but he does not have the full responsibility of the Jewish people. He cannot eat pork. He cannot violate the Shabbat. He cannot eat chametz. But at the same time, he doesn't have to listen to the shofar. He doesn't have to eat matzah. Actually, matzah does have to eat, actually. He doesn't have to put on tefillin, and so on and so forth. This is a subject in and of itself. But there's this Gemara that seems to indicate that Rabbi Eliezer came into a shul, talking about in the Talmudic days, and he did not have a minyan. There was only 9 people. And so, when you free this individual, he naturally becomes a full-fledged Jew. So Rabbi Eliezer freed his Eved, his indentured laborer, making him a full-on convert. The problem is, there's a mitzvah that says, La'olam behem tavoidu, you're not supposed to free them. I know this sounds very politically incorrect and very laden, and I don't want to get into it now. There's explanations and answers, and everything is not exactly what you think it is. Let's stick to the point here. The point here is that this kind of freedom, this act, is an act which is biblically proscribed. It is not permitted min haTorah. So you have to have a really good reason to do that. What's his reason? So the Rosh has a whole discussion about this. And he says, maybe it was for a biblically mandated Torah reading. Because after all, the prayers as we have them, they're only rabbinic. The concept of prayer may be biblical, but the notion of davening and baruch Hu and kedusha, for which you need a minyan, that is certainly rabbinic. And he says the following. He says, I do not believe that the story of Rabbi Eliezer happened to be Parshat Zachor. I don't believe that was the case. But what we do glean from this Rabbeinu Asher is, Mistaberli the mighty Ba'asara Deiraisa, Loi mistabeli, he says, I do not believe that it was a situation where it was a biblically mandated Torah reading. Kigoin, what would be a biblically mandated Torah reading? Kigoin likres Parshat Zachor, to read Parshat Zachor, shahu min haTorah, that this is from a biblical source. And he says it doesn't seem to be the case. The mashma b'cholinian, it seems from Rabbi Eliezer's story, from the narrative there, that it would be for even saying something as simple as Kedusha or Baruch Hu. I'm not getting into it now. It doesn't matter what Kedusha is or what Baruch Hu is. I'm simply, though, sharing with you a line out of the Rosh, where the Rosh says that listening to Parshat Zachor with a minyan, this we didn't hear yet, listening to Parshat Zachor with a minyan, reading the Torah, and Parshat Zachor is a biblically mandated thing. It's right here. Black and white, right here. The Rosh says this is biblically mandated. And now, I'm going to take you to a responsa, very early responsa, known as the Trumas Hadeshen. And the Trumas Hadeshen was also a great Rishon. In question 108, he records the following query. People lived in a small village. They did not have a minyan to pray with. This has been the case very many times throughout Jewish history. There were large swaths of Europe, shtettlach, where there wasn't a minyan. Tiny shtettlach, a few farmhouses. And so, these people were asking, they didn't have a rabbi, they wrote to a rabbi, he should answer their question. They wanted to go to one of the larger towns for the days of Purim in order to listen to the Megillah with a minyan, as Jews do, go to Sholem Purim. So he says, the question was, is it more important for us to go on the Shabbat before Purim? Do we have to make the effort to leave home, not only for Purim, but on the Shabbat prior? That's the question. Fair question? In other words, is the reading of Parshat Zachor as important as the reading of the Megillah? So these Jews are not totally ignorant. They knew this is a big Shabbat, and people made a hoopla about it, but they said, is it important as the Megillah? Do we have to displace ourselves? It's no fun to go travel. Maybe it was a day or two of traveling, and you have to sit on somebody's head and be a guest somewhere. So for Purim is one thing. Do I have to go for Shabbat also? So the Trumas Hadeshen writes them back. He says, not only should you also go for the Shabbat before, but I would say if you have to make a choice between Purim, Parshat Zachor, go to Shulam, Parshat Zachor. He said it's more important than Purim. How can that be? He says, even though the Mikra Megillah Adifa, even though the mitzvah of listening to Megillah is such an important mitzvah, and we know that all of the mitzvot are cast aside in order to fulfill this mitzvah. All the mitzvahs, as the expression goes, mevatlan Talmud Torah. We stop the public study of Torah in order to fulfill the mitzvah of listening to the Megillah. He says, Mikol Makom, nonetheless, l'das roiv haposkim, by virtue of the majority opinion. Nikrasi biyachid, the Megillah does not require a minyan, and you can read the Megillah all by yourself in your home as long as you're reading it right from a proper parchment. You don't need a crowd. You can invite a guest rabbi, somebody knows how to read the Megillah. Give him enough money, he'll come and stay in your town with you. But he says, the reading of Parshat Zachor, he says the Rosh says that it's biblical. And the Rosh says not only it's biblical, the Rosh says that this is min haTorah with a minyan. And therefore, he says, it would easily override the negative commandment of L'olam behem ta'avoda, which I mentioned before, that Rabbi Eliezer did what he did, and he could have done it in order to fulfill this mitzvah. The Trumas Hadeshen says further that in the Tosfos Shans, which is the second Tosfos I shared with you, in Shum Kriya Midiraisa, there is no Kriya, no reading which is biblical, save Parshat Zachor. In the shorter Tosfos in Brachas, the first Tosfos I read to you, he says it's referring to Parshat Zachor and Parshat Para Aduma. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. We'll get to that. What is Parshat Para? But he says, it's clearly, everybody agrees this is Minat Torah. And he says in Sefer Mitzvahs Cotton, it also says that. And therefore he says, you're asking me? I say not only should you also go for the Shabbat before, I say you should make the extra effort, primarily for the Shabbat before, a bigger effort than Purim. He says, but I don't know what to tell you. People don't take it as seriously. There are more people in Shul on Purim than on Parshat Zachor. But he says, really, if you ask me, my logic dictates Parshat Zachor is more important. There you have it. I brought you 4 outstanding sources. 2 Tosfos, a Rosh, and Trumas Hadeshen, All Rishonim, they're all telling you that this, in fact, is biblical. So what's the halacha? Well, let's take a look in the Shulchan Aruch. In the Shulchan Aruch, in Simin Tov Reish Pehei, which is chapter 685, there is a section of the Shulchan Aruch which is called Seder Dalet Parshias, the order of the 4 special Torah readings. And here we see, in the bottom, in the last subsection, which is Seif Zayin, the subsection 7, it says, Yesh Omrim, there are those who say, Sheparshat Zachor and Parshat Parah, Chayovim Likroisa Midaraisa, you're obligated to hear it biblically. And therefore, Lefikach, Bnei HaYeshuvim, the Jewish people who live in small towns, Ein Lahem Minyan, they don't have a minyan, they don't have a regular shul attendance, then Tzrichim Lavi L'Makim Sheyesh Minyan. Then they must uproot themselves and go to a place where there is a minyan for these Shabbatot. Practical halacha. It could be a Jew who lives somewhere for business. And he's doing what he's doing. He's out on a rig. Comes Parshat Zachor, he has a mitzvah to leave wherever he is and go to the local Jewish community and listen to Parshat Zachor because it's a biblical reading. So even the Shulchan Aruch is saying halacha l'maaseh, actual halacha, this is called a biblical mitzvah. The question, of course, is, how does that work? How does that work that it's a biblical mitzvah? How could it be a biblical mitzvah? We just read before that the concept of Torah readings are all rabbinic. So the Magen Avram says something very interesting. He says, you saw the Trumas Hadeshin himself say, ha'olam lo zehiri b'hachi. People don't take Shabbat Zachor more seriously than they take Purim. Well, why not? He says the fact that people don't take Shabbat Zachor as seriously as Purim should tell you something. And so he suggests something very interesting. He says, Liyashev minig ha'olam, to explain people's behavior, which should not be chalked up to laziness or slothfulness. We have to assume our ancestors wanted to do the right thing. He says, does it say in the Torah, you must read Parshat Zachor on this Shabbos? Of course it doesn't. Our sages ordained that this biblical reading should take place on this Shabbos. Why? Because there's lots of people in Shul. And Samach LePurim, it's close to Purim. And that's Kedei Lismech, Maisa Amalek L'Maisa Haman, to draw juxtaposition and to link the story of Amalek and the story of Haman, who is, of course, an Agagite, a direct descendant of the king of Amalek. And Shaul's failure is what gave rise to the ultimate near disaster of the Purim decree. And therefore, Vayave Amalek, Nami Zoicher Maisa Amalek. Therefore, he says, the Torah reading on Purim morning is also about Amalek. It's also a Torah reading. And the Magen Avram says, in that case, you didn't have to fulfill it on Shabbos. You could just as easily fulfill it by coming to Shul on Purim. So even though rabbinically we emphasize the concept of coming to Shul on Parshat Zachor, but biblically speaking, the mandate of hearing Parshat Zachor from the Torah does not have to be at a certain time, but instead, you could do it on Purim as well. And in this way, he explains that's why people were more concerned about coming to Shul on Purim than they were about coming to Shul on Shabbat Parshat Zachor. Of course, the Trumas Hadeshin says otherwise. And the Magen Avram is trying to explain people's lackadaisical attitude. But the Trumas Hadeshin says, I acknowledge people don't take this seriously, but if you're asking me, you need to be there for Shabbat. Now, there's something here that doesn't really make sense. He says, you know why they did it on the Shabbat before Purim? I'll tell you why, he says. Because there's a big crowd in Shul. No. It's a big crowd in Shul because it's Parshat Zachor. It's not because there was a big crowd in Shul, that's why they made Parshat Zachor. It's like a circular argument. So the Yad Ephraim explains. He says, really and truly, we wanted to do this on Purim. Purim is the day to read Parshat Zachor. However, he says, we don't want to do it on Purim because then people start to think that that's the message of Purim, but it's not really what Purim is about. This precedes Purim. And therefore, he says, the closest time to Purim that there'll be a big crowd in Shul is on Shabbat. Because Shabbat, people come to Shul. People don't come all week, will come on Shabbat. Therefore, we want to make it close to Purim, but we're looking for a time when already people are gathered. Shabbat is that time, so we made Shabbat Parshat Zachor. So now we understand two things. Number one, it is a biblical mitzvah to hear Parshat Zachor at some point, not a biblical mitzvah to hear it on this Shabbat. Our sages ordained that the biblical mitzvah of hearing Parshat Zachor should take place on this particular Shabbat. Which of course begs the question that this essentially flies in the face of the way we typically understand biblical mitzvahs that are time-bound. All biblical mitzvahs that are time-bound, as a rule, will always have a specific time ascribed to them. It doesn't say, well, blow the shofar at some point, some way, somehow. It says, blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. It doesn't say, take a lulav whenever you want. Oh, Sukkot is a great time. No, it says, take a lulav on Sukkot. So why is it all of a sudden we have this strange mitzvah where we say, well, it's a mitzvah, but you can figure out when you do this mitzvah. What does that mean? And what does it mean it's a mitzvah? It's a mitzvah to do once a year, then it should have a yom tov, a time for it. How did this once a year mitzvah kind of land on a doorstep, and then we're trying to figure out where to slot it in? So something clearly has to be understood. And so, let me share with you the words of the Gemara in Maseches Megillah. And this is, very interestingly, the Gemara on page 18, side A. The Gemara here is not talking about Parshat Zachor. The Gemara is here talking about the reading the Megillah. But the Gemara tells us that the halachas of reading the Megillah are lifted from the halachas of Parshat Zachor. The Gemara quotes the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Kara al peh, if you read the Megillah by heart, meaning not looking inside the actual Megillah, so then lo yotza, then you didn't fulfill the mitzvah. So the Gemara says, Minolan. Where do we know that from? Based on what it says, you have to read the Megillah. That says that in the Megillah. But it doesn't say you couldn't read it by heart. It says you have to read the story. So I read the story. If I know the story by heart, who cares? It's the same story being told. Amar Rava. Rava said, I'll tell you how. We learn this by means of juxtaposition to something similar. This is called a Gzeira Shava. We draw a line between two concepts in Torah. Zechira, Zechira. Ksiv Hacha. It says here with the Megillah, and this is found in chapter 9 of the Megillah, verse 28, V'hayomim ha'elu nizkarim v'nasim. These days are remembered, made and remembered. V'ksiv Hasam. And it says with regard to Amalek, this is found in Exodus 17, verse 14, Ksov zot zikaron b'sefer. Inscribe this as a memory in the book. So he says, Malahalon, just as when the Torah speaks about memory, it ascribed and attached the concept of memory to a book. Read the text. So to Afkan b'sefer, so to here, it must be read from a text. So the Gemara says, Umimai dahai zechira kriyi. Who says that remembering requires reading altogether? Maybe that remembering just requires remembering. If I have to say to you, you must remember. If you don't remember the number, you will not be able to get into the house tonight. And don't call me at 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm giving you the code to get in the house. You must remember this. So what are you going to do? What would you do?
Write it down.
Yeah, one idea is to write it down. But what if you don't write it down? Lots of people don't write things down. They have a way of committing it to memory. Commit it to memory. Do I care if you write it down or commit it to memory? Or record yourself a note on your iPhone? I don't care how you remember it. So maybe this is about remembering. It's not about reading. If the code to the house is like all Jewish codes, 1818 or something silly like that, so you don't have a hard time remembering that. Do I have to verbalize it? Unless it's voice activated. No, I can key the numbers in. So how do you know this remembering requires any kind of reading? The Gemara asks. And the Gemara says, I'll tell you how I know. He says, Dilma, maybe it's not reading. Maybe it's Iyun Ba'alma. Maybe it just means reading. People read with their eyes. Libraries are some of the quietest places on planet Earth. Nobody's reading out loud. A yeshiva, that's another story. But people can read without making noise. So the Gemara says, Leisalka daitoch. Did you not realize that you would figure this out, kind of. Dichsiv, it says, Zachor, remember what Amalek did to you. Okay, so I would say, okay, Zachor, remember. It's a mitzvah to remember. Where is that mitzvah? Remember in my heart. So Yochel Belev, I didn't think that's in the heart. Kishu Eimer, then he comes afterwards and he says in verse 19, after he tells it to remember, he says, Loi Sishkoch, don't forget it. That's kind of a redundancy. If you said, remember it, you don't have to say, don't forget it. One or the other would work. So Hare Shikchas Halev Amar, it says already. You got it right there. It says that you shouldn't forget it. So why does it have to say, remember it, don't forget it? Hamani Mekayim Zachor. If Al Tishkach means don't forget it, then why do I have to say, remember it? And the Gemara says that it means bepeh, that it means verbalizing. So from here I know that when the Torah comes along and says, you must remember the story of Amalek, it doesn't just mean you must remember it. That already I know from Al Tishkach, don't forget it. So what do you have to do? What is expected of us? The answer is, what's expected of us is a verbalization, a reading. It doesn't say anything about a public reading here. But invariably, if it says Ksov Zot B'Sefer, write it in the book. And whenever it says it, write it in the book. See, I can't find the book and I'm looking for it. So, in that pasuk, okay, I remember what it says. On that pasuk says B'Sefer, the Ibn Ezra says that it means some kind of book. The book called Milchamas Hashem, the wars of the Jewish people. Wars of the Jews. This was a book that was written in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. Actually, you have to say that they had it written down in some kind of book, because how did they fulfill this mitzvah for the first 40 years of our national existence? The first Sefer Torah was not completed until the end of our 40-year sojourn on the day of Moshe Rabbeinu's passing. He completed 13 Sefer Torah. So if Moshe Rabbeinu gave them a mitzvah to remember it, and it had to do with a book, there must have been some kind of book. So Ibn Ezra says it could be a Sefer Torah, it could be the book. Ramban Nachmanides says no, it refers to where it's going to be written in the book of Deuteronomy. Moshe Rabbeinu is talking futuristically. You're going to write this in the book, and when you write it in the book, that's when you're going to remember it. So at any rate, there seems to be a link between not just a book, but ultimately a Sefer Torah. And the Sefer Torah gets read when? When we have a minyan. You don't just take out a Sefer Torah and read from it. Torah readings require a minyan. Torah readings require a public. Torah readings require some kind of obligation. It's not so simple. So we understand that the verbalization has to be invoked. You can't just remember it. You have to actually read it. And it says Ksov Zot B'Sefer, so that the reading it is connected not just to reading it in a book. So if I'm reading in a book, I'm reading in a Torah, the natural logic is that I have to then read it from a Sefer Torah. Okay, so if I have to read it from a Sefer Torah, that's very nice, and that kind of makes sense. But how do I know that it has to be done on an annual basis? So in the Sefer HaChinuch, Rabbi Aaron Halevi, the presumed author, he says, he quotes this idea not from the Gemara in Masechet Megillah, but rather from the Sifri, from the writings of our sages that are found in the book of Deuteronomy. Even though in our Sifri this is not found, the Rambam quotes the Sifri, and the Sefer HaChinuch quotes the Sifri. There was a version of the Sifri that had this there. And it says, the Sifri says, Zachor et asher beficha. Zachor et asher asa. Remember what he did. Yochel b'vavcha. The Sifri says, I would think I could do this on my heart. Kisho emer lo tishkach. Then it says, don't forget it. Hare shikras alev amura. It says, don't forget it in your heart. Well, how do I work out Zachor? If it said already, don't forget, what is the point of Zachor? Remember. What's the positive commandment? Remember. If you told somebody you're not allowed to forget, obviously he has to remember. It's impossible to not forget without remembering. So he says the Zachor means that you should verbalize it, that you should speak about this, that you should say it. That's what the Sifri says. And the reason that you should say it and read it is so it shouldn't be forgotten. The Sefer HaChinuch says, on this memory, that we were commanded to remember what Amalek did to us in our hearts, and by saying it, lo yodainu bazman kavua. We do not have an official time for it. The Torah doesn't give us a time. Like it says that we should remember certain mitzvahs like Zechiroi Yitzias Mitzrayim, we have to remember every single day. It doesn't say that. Or it just says we shouldn't forget it. So we shouldn't forget it, and therefore it would be enough, he says, to read it on an annual basis, or maybe even every 2 or 3 years. Because originally the Torah was read in a manner that was completed every 3 years. And he says this is the way it was for a long time. In many places, the Jewish people read the whole Torah, not in 1 year, but over 3 years. And he says perhaps this is the reason that the Jewish people established a custom of dedicating one Shabbat to the reading of Parshat Zachor. So there will be a special Shabbat. And this would give the mitzvah an established presence and ensure that everybody did the mitzvah. We wouldn't assume that everybody would read it from the Torah. We wouldn't just assume they would kind of fulfill this mitzvah. Our sages said we have a mitzvah. The Torah expects something of us. In order to ensure that everybody actually does this mitzvah, then the logical thing is to establish an official time. When is that official time? The Shabbat Shalifnei Purim. And the Sefer HaChinuch says, this is what you hear from the Shari Ephraim before, V'din yiyeh lekreisa b'yom Purim. Really and truly it should have been read on Purim. And by the way, it is. It is read on Purim. It's just the other location. It's where we find it in Shemot, not in Devarim. Ki Haman Rasha Mizarei, because Haman was from a direct descendant of Amalek. So the people will not think this is a part of celebrating Purim and a later injunction, but this is an earlier injunction. This is actually biblical. So therefore it was established on the Shabbat prior to Purim. And so once a year, we make sure that we fulfill a biblical mitzvah of coming together to shul with the express purpose of reading about Amalek. And why does it have to be done on an annual basis? Very simple. The logic is this. In the Gemara Maseches Brachas on page Nunches Amud Beis, page 58-2, the Gemara says that if a person sees a friend who he hasn't seen in 30 days, he should make a bracha. The bracha is Shechianu v'kimanu v'gyanu l'zmanazeh. We don't really do this today, but that's what the Gemara says. Then the Gemara says, what if you didn't see him for 12 months? A whole year has gone by. The Gemara says, then you should make a bracha, Baruch Mechaya HaMesim, the resurrection. Why? So the Mefarshim say, maybe because if you make it through Rosh Hashanah and judgment and you're still alive, wow, that's great. It says, Mechaya HaMesim, you're granted reprieve, another year of life. The Gemara then says, Omarav, Ein HaMeis Mishtakach Min HaLev Ela La'achar 12 Chodesh. The dead are not forgotten from the heart only if they're not mentioned for 12 months. How do we know this? Because it says, Nishkachti Kemeis Milev, Hoyisi Kilche Oived. The dead were forgotten from the heart like a lost item. And the halacha is that a lost item has to be returned. It's a biblical mitzvah. But do you know that after you made an effort to return the lost item, when a full year goes by, you no longer have to seek out the owner? This was in a time when there was an official process. There was a special stone, and you had to come on that big stone platform in Yerushalayim, and people came 3 times a year, and you had to announce, I found a lost item. And you had to do it Pesach, and you had to do it Shavuot, and you had to do it Sukkot. So if you did it over the 3 festivals, then at that point, a year's cycle has gone by, and at that point, nobody's looking for it anymore. If nobody's looking for it, then it becomes ownerless, and then it's finders keepers. So we see that if you don't talk about a person for a whole year that's gone by, he becomes forgotten. And of course, what do we do once a year? We memorialize our dear departed ones. How do we do so? We say Kaddish. We say Kaddish once a year. And Nachmanides, Ramban, gives us a phenomenal concept here. He talks to us in the book of Leviticus, in chapter 25, where it speaks about a home that can be redeemed, a home that was sold in an urban setting. And he says the home can be redeemed for the first year. If the seller comes back and says, I was desperate and needed cash, I want my house back. You have to do the right thing. And the right thing is, let him give you the money and he gets his house back. But if a year passes by, then it's not required anymore. Ramban says, do you know why? He says because the first year a person experiences tremendous heartache at being out of his house. After a full year goes by, he says, it becomes forgotten. People move on. For a year, for 12 months, he says, it's in your heart. Now, of course, there's a big problem here. And the problem is that we all know this is a leap year. And we haven't heard Parshat Zachor since Not 12 months ago, but 13 months ago. But here it says 12 months. If it has to be done 12 months, what happens to the concept of forgetfulness? So the Chatam Sofer says something amazing. He has a whole discussion whether or not you have to do it every 12 months or every year. He says it's not every 12 months. A leap year just means it's a longer year. And he uses the following svara. He says when people, God forbid, lose a loved one, he says what happens is, at every juncture in the year, they say, ugh, it's the first Pesach. It's the first Lag Baimer. It's the first Shavuos. It's the first Tisha B'Av. It's the first Elul. Everything's a first. It's the first Purim. But he says when it's a leap year, you still haven't got to Purim yet. So God forbid somebody lost a loved one on the right after Purim, he's dreading the first Purim. He says, that's my first Purim alone. My first Purim. So he says, really and truly, it's not about 12 months, it's about an annual cycle. And he says, as long as the nature of the annual cycle is such that we go through all kinds of changes on an annual basis. And he says, when we go through those annual basis, he says, that's the meaning of things becoming forgotten. He says, it's not the 12 months, it could be the 13 months. He uses fascinating verbiage here. He says it will always follow the concept of Shana, which is the concept of cycle, and therefore, if we remembered Amalek last year on the Shabbos before Purim, if we didn't get to the Shabbos before Purim yet, it's still there. As long as a Purim doesn't pass, we can still fulfill this biblical mitzvah, this concept. And then I will finish now with this. So now, I've explained to you how it could be a biblical reading. I explained to you how the concept of reading on this particular Shabbat does not necessarily have to be biblical, but it is a rabbinic injunction of an appropriate time to fulfill this biblical mitzvah. But the question remains, and this question is actually asked by none other than the Magen Avraham himself. He says there are a number of things which the Torah tells us to remember. None of them have to be remembered in a Sefer Torah, even though they're things that have to be remembered verbally. The Magen Avraham in chapter 60 in the Shulchan Aruch, in his commentary, says the following. He says, Lama tiknu likras parshas Amalek. Why do we find with Amalek's remembrance, mashaloi tiknu, what was not done with other zechirot? So we have to remember the manna, and we have to remember the Torah being given, and we have to remember going out of Mitzrayim, we have to remember Shabbat, and we have to remember what happened to Miriam, we have to remember the Egel. So he says, I'll tell you why. He says, because for the Torah being given and the events around that, we have Chag Atzeret, we have Shavuot. So we have a holiday that celebrates this. He says, for Shabbat, you have to remember Shabbat. You're celebrating Shabbat, you're observing Shabbat. And then he says, the story of Miriam, the story of the Egel, this is not a complimentary situation. So would you want to trumpet it out? Go read about it? So the Rebbe asks, it doesn't really answer the question though. The Rebbe says, in that case, the question still remains though. I understand why those would not need to be read perhaps by Torah, but ultimately, the Rebbe's question is that why specifically would this have to be read from a Sefer Torah? What is so important about Amalek, of all things to remember, that this requires a Sefer Torah? And in a word, the Rebbe says as follows. There's tremendous power to a Torah being read. Not just a rabbinic idea, not just a custom, a convention of the Jewish people, but the Torah being read has an impact. Even if you don't feel the impact. Even if we don't know about the indelible mark that it leaves. The fact that a Torah is read publicly and the fact that you are present has to impact you, necessarily. That's the nature of a Torah reading. And the Rebbe says, the greatest danger of Amalek is not the Amalek outside of us, but the Amalek inside of us. Amalek is characterized with the notion of cooling the passion and becoming indifferent. That's what Amalek represents. In the words of our sages, Amalek is Yodea et Ribono u'mechaven limrod bo. He knows his master. He seeks specifically to rebel against him. And so, when a member of the Jewish people says, I know God, I know Torah, I know mitzvahs, are you planning to do them? Well, it's okay. Let's not get all excited. It doesn't make a difference. I'm Jewish anyway. That's called the Amalek inside us. And if we become indifferent, then how could we expect the world to remain impartial? Why shouldn't Amalek rear its ugly head again? In other words, it all starts from within. And because fighting and remembering Amalek has to start from within, because if we will remember who Amalek is, and we will remember the evil nature of Amalek, and we will ruminate on this on a regular basis, and we will remember it, then we will rout out the Amalek from inside of us. And when Am Yisrael routs out the Amalek from inside of it, we have the koach, we have then the strength to battle the Amalek on the outside. And that's why a Torah reading is required by dint of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's direct command in the Bible, Midoraisa itself. In other words, all of the annual mitzvahs are connected to a special opportunity to download a special energy that's only available on this particular day. You can blow the shofar any day of the year, nothing will happen. I mean, you may get a headache, but it will not change you. You can eat matzah any day of the year, other than indigestion, nothing will happen. But if you eat matzah on the night of Pesach, it fortifies your faith. If you listen to a shofar on Rosh Hashanah, it will wake your psyche and soul. That's the nature of these mitzvahs. But then there's a mitzvah like remembering Amalek. Really, it's something which the Rambam says you have to do continuously. The Rambam says, L'zichri tomid. You have to remember it always. And the Minchas Chinuch says that from the words of the Rambam, Nira shehi mitzvah tmidius. It's one of the constant mitzvahs. Like you have to believe in God every day of your life. You have to remember Amalek every day of your life. In other words, you have to not be indifferent to Yiddishkeit every day of your life. And here's what the Torah says to us. This is not a mitzvah which is applicable to a particular time. This mitzvah has to be observed really and truly every day of the year. But in order to make sure that we can keep it fresh and dynamic and potent, at least once a year, you have to have it read from a Sefer Torah. And therefore, the Parsha of Zachor is really not a fulfillment of this mitzvah on this day, because it's a mitzvah that's applicable every day. It's only that by doing this once a year, we're able to keep the fervor and the energy of the mitzvah full and fresh and active, so that each and every day of our lives, we can rule out cooling the passions. We can rule out the concept of spiritual indifference. We can whip up within ourselves a frustration and an anger against all that opposes Kedusha, holiness, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And by being willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's unpopular, and by willing to learn the lesson of history, remembering what Amalek did to us constantly, we, the Jewish people, will make it through the last dark days of Galus, and in Meretz Hashem, merit the blotting out of Amalek for good with the coming of Mashiach, B'mheira, will be Amen. Amen.